Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the final in a series of 14 panels where we've taken a look at the gender data gap within the startup ecosystem and the startup ecosystem. This has been an eye-opening and very inspirational, motivational group of seminars. And today, I think this is a great way to end this series with Beth Rudin, who is going to be taking a look with us at the gender-based algorithmic bias. Before we get into the panel, I would like to just recognize the lands on which I'm presenting from. And I'm in Collingwood, and Collingwood resides within the territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, which includes the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation and Saugeen First Nation, and is home to many Indigenous people, including Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here, Beth. I am so excited about this conversation because honestly, one of the books that inspired me the most was to really kind of bring this in is Invisible Women, where it actually talks right off the top about data bias in a world designed for men. So this is a fitting conversation to have here at the end. And I want to really start off with the origin story. And the reason why I like to start off with these origin stories is because when we're at this grassroots level of startups and entrepreneurship, we are the people that affect the greatest amount of change. So let's unpack who and how and where we come from. What is your origin story?
So I like to say very much to a lot of the people that I mentor and I sponsor, I get to talk to, is that a career is something that is a lot easier to look back on than to try to help navigate while you're in it. And if I had tried to predict I would be where I am, there is no way that I could. So in my undergrad, I had the fortune to have parents to tell me to go to school for what I loved. So I did Greek and Latin, and I went to Italy and I did digs, and I was an archaeologist. And then I did my graduate work at University of Denver in Colorado and did lots of work with the Native Americans, some litigation water rights kind of stuff, and Shoshone and Duck Valley. But what I really got out of understanding from the archaeology and some of the studies that I did then, and I didn't know this when I was going through it, is discovery, and discovery of the stories of people is so malleable, and it is so relevant to the context of the person who is telling that story, and what the software that they have in their own heads based on their own social structures and societal structures that they were rendered to. So that was always that statement in and of itself is a great way to kind of like set up. I sold out instead of going to get my doctorate because I had to pay off some student loans, was a very poor traveling consultant, but I had programming skills, which really helped me be able to land a good enough job and be able to kind of walk into a client after reading a book on the plane on how to, debug a particular program, and learned a lot. And I got into information systems, and I got into architectures, and then I got to build the data science profession within IBM. I got to start my own business within IBM, run that business for a number of years, move back into consulting, go through lots and lots of trials and tribulations, and submitting myself to scrutiny, doing lots of pitches, being told twice that, $100 million idea is just not good enough. Could you just come up with the $1 billion idea? Working with what I call squishy human monopoly kind of money type things. But I think that where I am today is I am an IBM Distinguished Engineer, and my area of expertise is cognitive science, which as an anthropologist, I define my terms, and I define as binding psychology and philosophy and computer science together. And that's what I do in order to use data and the scientific method in order to really help our clients and customers make better decisions on how they are going to use technology. And I have a great deal of focus on trustworthy AI that is explainable and relevant and useful for augmenting human beings, and an understanding, a hope, a dream that companies will compete on how they treat their employees and their employee data with dignity. Like, I think that that should be a competition point.
It should be indeed. And I think that we're walking into this world of big data with perhaps a few blinders on. And I'm hoping that we'll unpack a few of those blinders right now. And sorry, I think it's hilarious, the squishy human monopoly money side of things, and the fact that $100 million idea is not enough. And which is a very scary and real issue that we're dealing with, because female founders stereotypically, they only get about 3 to 4% of the funding that's given out to founders. So, and unfortunately, over COVID, that's even dropped down lower. Can you believe it? Lower, down to 2% globally. And these are some of the issues that we're going to need to start to unpack. And what is the real reason that you followed this path?
When I was younger, I would tell you that it's to learn and to gather more knowledge. When I got a little bit older, it was because I was nervous walking into a room without facts. So I did a lot of research. I do a lot of research. I do a lot of work in order to be able to always have an answer and always have facts at my fingertips that I have done the work for. And what I discovered in that journey is that when you do the work and you do the understanding of where that data comes from, and you are looking at the data as a data scientist that is curious about the context of that data and where it comes from, it can tell you the most amazing stories. And those stories should be pushed into insights that really help the business do better. But the conflict is that the quarterly return shareholder viewpoint of how business is structured is that it's often not linked to that directive ROI that will happen within the quarter that you get the investment to do the thing. So I think that one of the biggest things that drove me on this path was always solving for X. And solving for X meant I had to learn what margin expansion is, and other things in the business world, in order to be able to just do my own learning on how data is formed and how data is put into systems to be able to render insight and the information that a human may need in order to make a better decision. And I think that type of fight for justice, and I'm always feel like I'm fighting for making jobs in Central and Eastern Europe, especially today, now in this time, working with companies that are interested in creating jobs in places all over the world, as opposed to just sucking out as much as they possibly can. I've had the proverbial, chief financial officer look at me and say, "Beth, could we automate all the cost out of our business?" Cost being, in quotes, being a euphemism for a human being. I'm like, sure, a full for-profit business sounds lovely. Why don't we do that? But I think that the words we use, the language we use, the financial structures that we have, the manipulation of the politics within organizations in order to have a ruler, again in quotes, or a big executive be able to play the game of, well, how do I increase the productivity of all of my people all of my resources in order to put more money into my treasury so that I can pay my key supporters so that I can stay in power. And I think that when I came in as a, programmer, technologist, interested in Claude Shannon and Ada Lovelace and information theory, I had no understanding of that human capacity for maintaining the power and the control. And I think that that's what you eventually learn that it's about when you move up in an organization and become an executive.
And I think that I want to unpack that a little bit more, because I'm so much of stories, numbers behind stories, and story through numbers. I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to be communicating, and we're constantly communicating as entrepreneurs, because that's what drives things. And you said at the very beginning, the discovery of a story, and that story can be malleable. And I'd like to unpack that a bit, because we also kind of took a look at, solving X for fun, and looking for these amazing stories through research. So tell me a little bit about the malleability of that story, then, of a story.
So, as an archaeologist, I would pull things out of the dirt. And we often know that a site has been excavated because we throw in a penny or something modern. So future archaeologists, if they encounter that, then they know that site's been excavated. But when we find something, it's in a particular strata. So it's at a particular layer that is literally in the dirt that has been packed down for centuries and centuries and centuries. And I remember being in Italy, blowing through 15th century Lombardy in order to get to Etruscan, works. And you're literally blowing through the core. But we would pull out objects. And if I pulled out an object and I go to a pier in London and say, hey, what is this? The very first thing that they would ask me is for the provenance and the lineage. Where'd you find it? What was the culture? What were the people wearing? What were they saying? What were they doing? What were they thinking? What was the music? What was the art? What other objects can we correlate that to? And then fundamentally, you make up the story to say, why did this person have this cup holder in a glassware? Why was it special to them? Was it, the joke is, was it religious? Did they perform a ritual? And I always laugh about that. And just to give people a little bit of an aha moment, imagine an archaeologist 200 years from now trying to describe what, the 133, the 3 ounces of liquid, all of those signs meant without any context whatsoever. And so we do things every day that we don't think about, but we are shedding evidence. And that evidence tells a story. Data are artifacts of human behavior. We either created the systems that create the data, or we create the data as human beings and artifacts and physical things that we can then, have a real grounded understanding of it, literally, pun intended. And I think that not enough people are thinking about things like evidence. And that's what we do as data scientists, is we look for evidence or features or predictors in order to really start to understand why, or the causality of why does something function in the way that it functions. In order to predict, you need to understand a bit more of why. And so what we have been doing with data is absolutely astounding, but it is all very gender biased, because data in and of itself, and the data of the 21st century, think about it. Google was created by 2 guys that wanted to organize the internet. And I ask kids all the time, I'm like, do you think all the data in the world is on the internet? And, the answer is invariably no, yes, no, I never thought about it. And I'm like, what did those 2 men not think about? What did they not put into the internet? What are the things like the feel? I always say the feel of my husband's callus, that's not on the internet, and that's data. So I think that your story question is so good. And it's Brene Brown who says data is a story without a soul. And that's our job as storytellers, as data scientists, as discoverers, as explorers, to say, what was the story behind this?
And I love that data is a story without a soul, and that's so poignant. And I'm desperately trying to remember which book it was. So it's either Invisible Woman or it is Unwell Women. Or it could be another one. Oh, maybe it's Trampled by Unicorns. I cannot remember. But they were talking about this this warrior princess that was buried with all of her tools and all of her weapons and and even servants and for centuries this woman was considered a man. It had to be just a short man. It had to be somebody who had something, even though it was very visibly a female. But there's no way. And then even when they finally, without a definitive doubt, they confirmed that in fact it was a woman, they said, oh well, there must be another story behind it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're so quick to manipulate the story to be to adhere to a specific culture, lens, whatever it might be, that we lose sight of what the facts really are. And I'd like to kind of unwrap that a little bit more in this day and age where honestly so much has changed, but so little seems to be changed at all. How do we take a look or unfold or unwrap that story so that we can change the narrative on how we're presenting this data?
So, in when I was studying archaeology and when I went through my master's degree, I was ready to go to do my PhD in revisionist archaeology. And revisionism is a really interesting construct. And at the time, I was very young. And I'm like, we shouldn't revise history. We should let it lie. But I look back and I want people to think about this. Everything that we think today, there's over 188 cognitive biases that we all carry. That is ingrained in our software and probably into our hardware as well, to make assumptions about what is gendered and what is not. And there are so many aspects from our Native Americans and our First Nations that, you know, and other long cultures that have long traditions that we can study that may give us a different understanding of this very binary world that is not actually all that long in the history of human history. So I wanted to just sort of level set that you're showing the bias, like that story that you just told about the men who couldn't even consider it wasn't a man, it was a woman. It had to be a short man. And like all of these things, they are showing their bias. They are showing their software. They are showing what the software has told them to think and do and say and feel. And I have an article I can find that we did about the Mycenae and the Minoan society, who, if you know, there's lots of stories that we can go back and revise and look back on. And I think that it's important to do so because part of creation is taking something that was in the past that you love and that you cherish and making it relevant for today. So remixing it and reusing it and making it relevant. So I think that the process of doing that, I have a lot better understanding of how to do that than I did 25 years ago when I was about to go full scale into academia. In the business world, I'll give you a story where I was interested in helping out some of the very high level salespeople who were doing hundreds of millions of dollars of deals. So these deals, the average size was $100 million. I used to call it a $10 million room because there would be 10 guys men, and each one of them probably made about $10 million a piece. So you'd walk in this room and you'd try to sell them something that was a managed service. So shifting from what they do well to what we can do for them, or take that on. And what we did a lot of when I was back in the managed services division of IBM is we would take on customer service desks for companies and corporations. And this one very large banking institution, it was the very first time outsourcing. And the team that was running the service desk at the large financial institution was a team that had run the service desk for probably 2 decades, so for 20 years. And so when we first started taking on, and during the bid, I had to go up in a suit that was very uncomfortable in New York City in Battery Park on the 30th floor into this massive conference room, and I was petrified, literally shaking in my heels. And what I had done is we had gotten some of the data. And so I wanted to find something to show them, because I wanted to show the icing on the cake to the services about how we were using innovation and things to draw insight out of data. And I had taken a look at all of the pieces of data that had put together all these error messages that the ATM machines, like these were like really low level pieces of data that they just gave to us and said, go, whatever, this isn't really useful. This isn't really good. And so I did all of the research. I looked up what the error messages meant. I did like a pattern of where the error messages were, and then put together word clouds in different regions under the context of the world. And so my big story was, I'm like, hey, did you guys know that your ATMs were out of cash in Brazil? And I thought it was funny, because I was like, of course they know, they're reading the error messages, they're doing audits, of course they know this, it's just $100 million deal, $200 million deal, or whatever. Of course people know this, like, right? Somebody had been doing this. And the room literally, like, it was silence. And I'm like standing up, shaking in my heels, and they pull me out of the room. And I'm like freaking out. I'm like, what did I do? Did I spell something wrong? What happened? Like, I'm trying to figure this out. Turns out it was 1 month before the World Cup in 2015, 2016, don't know. And their ATMs were out of cash in Brazil. So I showed them a story just by doing what did the error code mean in English, and then putting together a word cloud that, the largest word, it said out of USD. And, they were like, how did you find that? How did you do that? Blah, 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 blah. End of the story. We got the deal. And it's like, those are the things that you can discover a haystack full of needles that are out there, because if you just take the time to understand who put in this data, who created the system to create the data, why was the data created, what are the human factors around looking at the data? I mean, I have many different stories like that, where if you are going to do data analysis, unfortunately, what a lot of data scientists do today is they just take huge volumes of data and shove them into different black box models or neural nets. And those neural nets are so sensitive that they can detect patterns. But all of that data, again, is gendered. It's all only really representative of like maybe half of our entire population or half the story. And I'm not saying that in a critical way. I'm stating that as fact. Most of our medical knowledge and all of these books that you have been so great to put in there, all of that is only half the story. Look at how much more we have to do. Look at how many more things we have to discover. Look at how many more things that we can make relevant from the past to today. Like, we can make them today much more relevant, in some ways than we were able to in the past, because we now have better technology to do so.
And I really love that analogy of the haystack full of needles, because if you're looking for a needle in a haystack that's full of it, it's going to be very obvious to find. And there's so much obvious that is about to unfold now
Yes.
that we're recognizing these data, not even recognizing, now that we're allowing ourselves to look at that. So in terms of that many needles in a haystack scenario, what is the first, and this will be two-part, what is the first time that you considered gender in a business decision that you made? And then secondly, what is the biggest aha data component that you uncovered?
Uh, Similar story. The One of the biggest gender thing that I realized early on in my career is that because I had sort of this secret ability to do the research and program and have the ability to analyze data, that was a superpower. And that put me in the same realm as the men. But I was a pleaser. So I had to go up and do all of these different things and get certified in things that the men didn't want to. And so, because they didn't want to, it actually allowed us to recreate and remix and do things like create data science professions. So, that was probably the gender is everywhere. When I submitted myself to scrutiny, I would submit myself to 18 men and two women. And when I asked the men, I go, imagine 18 women up here, 18 women in front of you that you are presenting your entire life to, everything that you've programmed, everything you've done, all of your architectures, all of your everything, and they're digging into it. 18 women digging into your life. How do you feel? And it is all around you. And the most what I would say the best way that I can frame it today is, and this is, if I'm wrong about this, I'm sure I will be told I'm wrong by somebody on the internet, but I think that the millennials gave us such a gift, because when they really started to say, maybe it's not man, maybe it's not women, maybe it's not binary, that leaves it too unexplored. Look at how much more we have to explore. So, I think that the language itself, the word vulva, for instance, meaning shame in Latin, this has been going on for a long time. So, this is not something that maybe it's not obvious to men, but it's very obvious to every woman who walks into any business situation. It is made to be, catastrophically all about making sure that people can do the thing to fit in the box to create the thing. But I digress. I don't know if I got off topic there. Can you help me bring that back?
You just, I'll bring just one other point in language as well. There's so much bias, and in the French language, le vagin is so vagina is actually masculine. So there's a bias that by
Yes.
yeah. So that was my big aha moment when I saw that. That was one of the first big aha moments that I had in terms of data, and that's what we wanted to kind of allude to next. So you did answer the first part, and thank you. And then the second part is, what is the biggest aha, gender-based aha moment that you've uncovered?
That it is, I'll probably go back. So I keep a picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg over my right shoulder to remind me that you should always know your audience. And you look in any data, you're going to find, different stories. And the stories that I often found where women were trying so hard to do the right thing, like, working on the service desk, and they had to select the right issue type from a thing of like 14,000. And so I had these two data scientists, and they were dual PhD data scientists, big, huge brains. And they came to Boulder, where I had access to a lot of the service desk agents, so I could sit with them and watch what they were doing, because that's important. The two data scientists did not want to talk to people at all. They wanted to analyze the data, and they, asked me for a room that they could sit in and analyze the data. And so I asked them to analyze all of the data, the service desk tickets data, and they came and they declared, they're like, Beth, 50% of all the service desk data is access issues. And I said, oh, really interesting. Let's go test that. And then I want you to put what we call now a privileged class against that. And it turns out that because the software that the service desk agents were putting in, they literally had 14,000 choices for one of our clients. And so we obviously reduced that. But almost 80% of the access issues, which began with A, which was right at the top of the list, were done by the male service desk agents, and the majority of the other ones were not. And it proved my hypothesis that, there were women who were suffering on the service desk metrics on how many tickets that they could perform, because they were trying to be more precise, where the guys were just like access issue, access issue, access issue. And it helped reframe hundreds of millions of dollars that was spent in identity access management issues that weren't really access issues. And so I think that that's a good story to talk about too, why you need to do better and expect more from data scientists to do their job and look at things from, the base angle. I want people to understand this and walk away thinking, find data scientists and data engineers and people who are super curious about how that data starts. What is the origin and the provenance and the lineage of that data? Because that will be a technologist that wants to use technology in order to understand what is the real problem.
I love that. Find data scientists that are curious and that want to look at the malleability of those stories, because they're the ones that are going to make the difference. And I want to actually move our conversation into the next step then, and that's a perfect springboard to get into there. And that is within the startup community, the startup ecosystem, when companies are at their most malleable and their stories are really, truly malleable. And I want to kind of give a scenario, first of all, of aha moments, right? And my daughter brought me a picture 2 years ago to try to explain what she was so excited. I understand what equity, the difference between equity and equality is. And I said, oh, yeah. And I'm thinking this is not much, but then I saw it and I had that aha moment. She taught me something. And it was these 3 equal boxes, equal, all the same height, same everything. And then there's a wall. And a man stood up on that first box and was able to see over to the other side, which was a game. A woman stood up on that same box, but it wasn't high enough for her. So she was unable to see over the box. And then the third box, there was a person in a wheelchair that couldn't even get up on the box. So it's about reframing that story, that malleability of that story. So from that context, what does actionable change look like? And what is that new narrative that we should be looking at in terms of data, in terms of presenting not these unicorns, because let's leave that unicorn scenario out to men who maybe are chasing after something that may not be real. And let's have women drive duck-billed platypus businesses that are so beyond unique that you have no choice but to recognize them differently, right? And there's so much data behind the duck-billed platypus that makes them something that you continuously want to research. What does that actionable change look like in terms of data?
So Equity, and thank you for bringing this up, because a friend of mine wrote an excellent LinkedIn post, and I need to go find that one. But part of it, and part of the response to that post, was a Twitter bot, and the Twitter bot actually called out what the company's median gap was between men and women. And so all of these companies are out there saying, we are diverse and we are inclusive, but we're not equitable. because and I love that type of I truly call that data, that is a form of data science, and it's data journalism, and it's to really use it as an impact tool. And so all this bot does is, goes out to a public site for the United Kingdom, where parity and pay has to be out there for all these corporations. So when the corporation submitted this is what we're doing for Women's Day, yay, we bought women flowers, or yay, we gave them all these things, and you're like, just pay me the same pay as men. It's super simple. Yep. And that's equity, where it's like the understanding of equality is good. I love that we can start to do that, but equity is a much harder thing to get at. And as a data scientist and doing what I do, and my specialty is I like looking at words and language, and understanding some of the nuances that can occur in order to develop indices to see if companies are really doing what they're saying. And so if you look at the ESG movement, which is equity and social good, and environmental and social good that is out there, I want to move that and create an equity index too, by looking at what is the outcome of some of the algorithms that a company is using, or what is the outcome over time. So, many people measure the wrong things. Most people measure the wrong things. And then many people are surprised at the behaviors of humans that match those measurements. Which, you could skip all of that and measure the things that you want to incentivize the human to do. So when you see a lot of people measuring attrition, for instance, you're teaching an AI who will leave your relationship. Why would you do that? Why don't you measure why people stay? It's going to tell you a lot more about your company. So when we talk about equity, and we talk about measurement systems, something that I'm very out and proud of is out loud and proud about is think about who benefits from the output of the algorithm. So, or who benefits from the output of the incentive program. Are your top sales guys, the ones that make their numbers year over year over year, are they the guys that you want to represent your leadership team? Are those the people who are the most trusted? Are those the people who have the community building? And if you really start to think about if you have a program to award the best new technical innovation, and most of the submissions are men, and then all of the winners are men, you don't have an equitable program. So equity, to me, is something that you can actually start to measure and create an index for, and then start to look at in a way that really drives much more social change. And there's a lot of things that we can do to start to uncover, like the Twitter app kind of thing, that says, well, actually, this company's pay gap is 50%. They pay their men 50% more than women. But yeah, they had something nice for International Women's Day. So I use that only to maybe put people on notice. Data is there. And, my mother used to tell me a lot, and my mother, is very much of an inspiration for me, in that, she went back to work. And when she went back to work as a controller, which is a C-suite for, accountants, she had to bring a note from my father, who was unemployed at the time, stating that she had adequate childcare in order to take this C-suite position, a literal note.
Wow.
And I listened to her about, some of the things that she had to do in order to become a successful woman in business. And I think about, if all of those engineers had actually listened to her, then, the company that they were trying to do some of the engineering would have been a lot more profitable. But because she was a woman, she didn't listen. So I think I'm off topic again, but I think that this equity construct needs to be in there, and the concept of just like a diversity and an inclusion kind of thing without equity, without looking at equity, you're missing the boat completely. And your idea of diversity likely doesn't take into account consent. Because if you ask every single one of your employees what they identify for, or what they identify as or for, wow, you get a whole different answer that shows an incredible diversity. And I work in a global company, 175 countries. Do I really have the right to assign somebody gender or race by looking at them? We should be asking for consent before even thinking about trying to take a baseline and thinking about measuring that. And is it equitable that the white man who has, the wife who stays at home and the perfect 2 kids, of course he's going to go say, I'm a white man, and, talk about, who he is, because he's not a marginalized person. He's the dominant paradigm. There's nothing, noteworthy there. And so I think we can open it up, like maybe the millennials have taught us, like, why can't we look at it as unexplored? Why can't we start to measure what our people are interested in and what our people identify as? And, that's going to open up so many different doors instead of check boxes. You got to check a box. We're beyond that.
And I think that's a really, so you made a slip, but perhaps it's a Freudian slip there too, is what are we identifying for?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And that's a really powerful statement right there, because why do we need to identify as anything at all? Growing up, that was one of the things that I hated most. I hated having to define myself, my marital status, when I talk to somebody, a Miss or Mrs., right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Ms.,
mm-hmm.
right? We have these 3 different ways of telling people how we identify our personal status. And I, when you put down on a resume, you want to just your initial rather than your name, because our name also qualifies us. And there's just so many data points on identifying our gender, identifying our status, identifying our culture. There's so many elements there. It's really, what are we identifying for? And that's an interesting aspect to kind of bring us into this. And I love that this has been full of so many metrics. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit more in terms of what action, and we'll bring it back. Let's bring it on to this, to the floor now. And I wanted, so there's that massive gender bias in how funds are being disseminated and how questions are being asked, even when they're delivered by a female investor. Is a female investor a male investor? The questions that tend to come out to founders, to female founders, tend to be very negative. So they're very preventative rather than proactive. So as an example, we take a look at the market. This is an extremely saturated market. How are you ever going to compete? You've got this competitor and this competitor and this competitor and this competitor. I have seen so many of this. It's you're just another one of these types of companies. And it's, as opposed to retraining how the investor takes a look at it, we're changing the mindset of the person that's that's receiving this information. So turning it around to be promotional. So for that particular one, are you asking about my go-to-market strategy changes the scenario? And we're unpacking this on a greater level so that that same type of narrative can be applied across the board to any interactions that you have. So if you come across a preventative situation, or somebody who's trying to tell you this is not what you're allowed to do, these stereotypical boundaries are kind of confining you, turn around, take account of what skill sets you have, take account of what tools you have so that you can be confident in it. And then when you're confronted by this, use that scenario around. With that as a scenario and sitting on that entrepreneurial investment platform, how can we use data as, oh gosh, I don't want to say a weapon, but I really, really do. How can we use data to bring about confidence in how we talk about what we're about to offer?
So when I looked at my own, when I got old enough and adult enough to have a portfolio, and I looked at my investment posture, I got to choose ESG indices and funds, and I got to choose what I invested in. And don't, what happens a lot with technology is that we instantly start to consume it, and then it just becomes, normal. But 10 years ago, I would have no idea what a B Corp was. I would have no construct to be able to buy clothing or buy the products that I did from local, women only that, believe in equity because I read through their blogs and did all the research. Or, we now have the ability to do things like the Pay Gap app, or, think through how we can bring data points or evidence with lineage and provenance, with showing your work. There's no hand waving in math. And give people those evidence trails so that they can make more informed decisions. And something that I get to do is we have so many beautiful, brilliant IBMers and IBM, and me and several of my co-partners, we often set up these challenges for our Academy of Technology. And it is our Academy of Technology. You notice even in our language, we are taking responsibility and accountability. And that's something that we look for in mission statements of companies on how much accountability they take for the layers of impact that their AI models might have onto communities and different things. But we are working on a equity-focused explainability. So even in explaining the data that went into the algorithm, who the algorithm benefits, and this goes back to who sponsored the study. And I'm gonna try to do this as a dialogue. So Cindy, who do you think is the most studied type of human for psychology outputs?
A white Caucasian male, probably in the ages of 20 to 30.
Maybe, but actually, I think more women. It's real simple. It's psychology students.
Oh.
So people tend to look at data, what they have lying around, instead of thinking about creating the data in the sense of creating a system or a program, or like I mentioned earlier, the consent by qualitatively gathering the data by asking the right question to the right people and then doing the analysis. So, this is where, you ask for actionable. Technology should augment people. If you see someone trying to sell you technology that they haven't used, question it.
Yes.
Right? Question it. Because when you start to use technology to augment, and this is what we're doing, is we're trying to use an understanding of technology to look for our words, to look for my team, to look for community builders, for glue workers, for people who are doing the work in order to tie these out. And we're trying to infer that to see if we can start to see what are different features that we could use that then incentivize people in a different way. And it is all about trying to get to equity, but you have to understand who is the equity for. And as you said, I dislike the Freudian slip, but we don't have a better idiom for that. So the slip I made, it's like, how do you know what you stand for? And I think it was Atomic Habits. There's a quote, and I might be wrong on this, but every action that you take is a vote for the person you want to become. Mm-hmm. So, you as a data scientist, when you're looking at that data and you're like, yeah, let me just curve off the, all of the things that don't fit this curve, and let me just fit my model to the data set, you're doing a disservice later when you try to put that model into production and flow real data over. In the same way, many people have just looked at, well, what is the dominant paradigm pushing out? And is that dominant paradigm typically pushes out things that are used to control people or to control the situation versus augment, which is why I want people to look for people who have technology that they use, because the ones that use the technology have created it out of a necessity to solve the problems that they have. So women who are running technology startups have often created that technology to solve a gap that they have. And that typically doesn't always have all of the bells and the whistles and the ROI and the quarterly return and the margin expansion and all of those different things that we have to do to make a good business. But if you look underneath, it's typically a good deal when people are using the things that they're, when it's used on you. And you're willing to use it on your children, that's when it's good. And conversely, when people don't want it used on their children, that's how you might not be working for or investing in the right company.
That's that's a great metric right there. And right back to the old adage that necessity is the mother of all invention, and you want to create the painkiller, not the vitamin, right? So that it doesn't have all that fluff behind it. And I think that's where the data needs to really kind of play out to support that necessity, the result of the necessity, the solution to the necessity, indeed. And I want to give a little bit of chance to kind of walk out of here with something. And you do, just by nature of what you do, everything you do has actionable consequence because you're bringing up data bias, right? Or what is the one thing that you know that you can leave here today to affect greater change?
Get people to, I think one of the things that I've been trying to shift, I do a ton of mentoring, a ton of sponsoring, and a ton of coaching. And when, my mentors finally get the courage up to ask me to be their mentor, it is, it's a sign that they want to go forward. But we do not have enough sponsors. And I'm really serious about this. The sponsor is the one that is going to speak for you, that is in those circles, that will pull you up and put you as part of the succession plan. And I think that major, large Fortune 500 companies have a responsibility and accountability to become more sponsored, because they are taking all of the top talent. My husband works for the government. He works for the Army, and he is a helicopter pilot. And they are dying because private industry has taken all the pilots in order to make all of the planes go sufficiently. And so when private industry is taking all of this talent and all of the people, what are those private industries giving back to the community that they take that talent from? And that is what I want people to look at. And I want people to think about that in terms of sponsorship, because when you think about yourself as a sponsor, you have the self-awareness to know that when you have a bad day, you cannot make that everybody else's problem. You have to be aware, and then you also have to be aware that somebody likely helped you get to where you are. So assume positive intent about some of the things that might be moving in mysterious ways, and have patience. But be a part of the right battles and the right moments where you can really sponsor the right people, and especially the right people that might not have all of the things perfectly, but look for that necessity. Look for what they have invented out of necessity. And you'll often find those haystacks full of needles.
What a great place to kind of end with. And I think that that's so powerful as well. So to be able to have that malleable story, and the stories that are really based on those numbers, and to take a look at that haystack that is actually completely full of needles. So you're not actually having to look too far. You just have to realize that they're there. And then to have that supportive, that sponsor. I hadn't even thought of that sponsor, because, and to make this whole series of panels actually happen, there were a number of strategic, not mentors, but sponsors that were able to pull strategic people into play, including the one that led me to you, which was Vedra. And I think that that is one person that has been, or a type of person that has been underrepresented on so many different levels. That sponsor, Teresa, you're one of those. That's definitely who I would qualify you as, is such a strategic person that makes things happen, but never gets recognized. So that to me is a big aha moment. I love the narrative about the, that the $1 million idea is not enough. Sort of that $100 million idea is not enough. Things that we have done wrong, taking a look at it from that perspective, because that's always something that that sets the ground for future possibilities. And then changing the narrative so that we are taking a look at the benefit from a necessity level, because the necessity, well, again, it's the mother of all, it's the birth mother of all invention. And it's no coincidence that we call it the mother of invention, because some of the most inspirational components of what we're doing have been designed or have started from women. And another amazing book that I want to kind of give a little bit of a shout out to is it The Mother of All Invention? Goodness. And I'll leave it in the notes, but it had my eye opening to the first car was actually developed or designed by a woman. The first electric car was designed by a woman. And isn't that funny that they were then later on designed out of vehicles altogether, to the point where vehicles we're driving around now are designed specifically for men and shorter men, because that's what the crash test dummies are. So even the seat belts are not designed for us. So I have appreciated this, and this has been an amazing journey of insightful and influential information. Again, driving those duck-billed platypuses rather than unicorns, because they're real. And Beth, thank you so much. And I'd like to just kind of leave a little bit of information. I had said that I was going to ask you this question, and I'm wondering if this conversation has either inspired an actionable change. But what I'd really like to hear about, if you can think of one, is there somebody doing it right now?
I think that there's a lot of individuals that are doing it right. And I think that if you want to look for those individuals, it's the person on your team who remembers to order the birthday cake. That individual is doing it right. The person who is doing all of the research for someone else, and sort of it's on the Statue of Liberty, but the weary, the tired, the desperate, and everyone should remind themselves that humanity and humans are so resilient. So look for the ones that are resilient, because those are the ones that have had the courage to ask for help, and that's what builds resilience. And so when we are looking at the shiny object or I always call myself a little bit of a magpie from a technology standpoint. I have to remember to look under the covers and think through, well, who were all the other people that went into this? And did those other people, are they using what you have built? Just some of those seminal questions can really help you find those people that are doing it right. And I don't have specifics because I think that the people who are doing it right are not the ones that are in the spotlight. And those people are not the ones that are visible. And so I think we need more people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg that knew that she had to change 9 men's opinion. So instead of looking for how women were being discriminated on the basis of sex, she went around and I don't know the numbers, but it wasn't 1, it wasn't 10, it wasn't 70, it was like hundreds of cases where men were being discriminated on the basis of sex to change 9 men's mind. And that's something that I always think about because it's these slow, small changes that we need to think through. Who's doing it right are the people who are slowly plodding away at entropy. Otherwise, entropy will win. You have to have consistent pressure to change course.
It takes a village, and I appreciate this. Thank you so very much. This has been very insightful. I like to add this little bit at the end. I lived right around the corner from my school, and I was running home. I saw my friend up ahead, Hilda, 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 and I realized as soon as I got up to her, it wasn't her. So I kept running and screaming around the corner her name until I was out of sight and out of earshot. So ladies, keep running and waving. Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you very much for